Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with hosts Jimmy Hinton
and Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And thank you to our patrons who helped make this podcast happen. If you would like to become a podcast patron, please visit patreon.com/speakingout. You can find out what different rewards there are for the different tiers, and help us out accordingly.
We love to reward our patrons.
We do.
We truly do. We love to surprise you with some extras some weeks, and we always do like to spend extra time with you.
Some people do Christmas in July. Some people do Christmas in November. We do Christmas year round.
There you go.
It is always Christmas at the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast.
It is. With our patrons. Yes. Thank you.
All right. So last week we talked about questions that you ask incoming church staff or church ministers, pastors. This week, we want to talk about questions that you ask people who are character references. So former churches, people who they have listed on their reference sheets. And I want to say that people also need to move beyond these references. Usually they'll ask for 2 references. 90% of the time, I'd say, when people ask me to be used as a reference, 90% of the time, I never receive a phone call. And I think that's crazy that churches, and I mean, just really any organization.
I was going to say, Jimmy, that's true in business.
They don't check their references.
Also. Yes, lots of times I'll be given a heads up. Hey, I used you as a reference. Be aware, and I never get a call.
Yeah,
I
rarely
even an email.
get a call.
Yeah, right.
I get asked all the time, and I very rarely receive calls. And when I do, the questions are really softballs.
Mm-hmm.
They're framed in a way where it's so gentle and non-probing, and essentially what I end up giving them is virtually nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not because I'm not willing to give them information. They just are not asking. They're not asking the right questions. So I would recommend that, especially in the church, if somebody's coming in as a full-time preacher or even a part-time preacher, find out every church that person has served at and call them all. Mm-hmm. You have every right, and in fact, I would say responsibility, to call every one of them. Whether they list them as a reference or not, I would call them, and I would find out whether they left on good terms or bad terms. And we're going to go through some of these questions that you can ask. And these questions are not specific to churches. These can be asked of anybody who's listed as a reference. And I think they're really important questions. And these are not to be substituted for the other questions, but to be asked in addition to. Because some of the other questions, they're pretty obvious questions about performance and, things like that. We don't have those questions listed because our questions are specifically to find out whether this person has scandal in their past, be it recent past or distant past, and how that was handled. Because a lot of times, what happens is there are known scandals, as is the case for this the new guy. What's his name? Justin Bieber's pastor who just got fired. Did you see that, Mom?
I did not.
So he was fired last week.
Did not. I have been off of pretty much all social media and news for the past 2 weeks, actually.
Yeah, so he's he was a pastor at New York City Hillsong Church, which is what's his name?
I
Brian.
Nope, don't
Brian,
know.
Brian. Why am I blanking on his last name?
I don't know.
Anyway, I had written an article about him and his dad, who was a pedophile, and that whole cover-up nonsense.
Oh, okay, I remember, but I don't remember the name.
Why am I
remember.
blanking?
Yeah, I don't.
My brain
know.
is kind of fried.
Your brain
today.
is in overload.
Anyway,
yeah.
So Brian Houston. So Brian
Okay.
Houston, I had written an article, and Brian Houston, got a pretty big jab in whenever I wrote that. Which whatever. Brian Houston made the announcement that Justin Bieber's pastor was fired, but gave no specifics.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like this generic, just trust that we had to do this, and we regret it, and our hearts are broken over this. Well, it turns out that he had been allegedly, anyway, having affairs with multiple church members, and then a fitness model came forward, and she claims to be a victim of his, and this pastor never told her who he was, what he did, and he said he was like some fitness coach or something, and
wow.
claimed that they were in love, and he wasn't married, didn't have any kids, and so they were sleeping together, and so finally she kind of blew the whistle on that when she found out who he actually was, and anyway, it turns out, surprise, surprise, she's not the only one. So, you're going to run into churches constantly who pull the Brian Houston moves, and they're like, yeah, that we let them go, or they'll frame it in a way where they were resigning, where it looks like the person left on their own free will, when actually they were fired. So, it's important to ask these questions to find out what actually happened and what scandals were at these churches. And Bieber's pastor, he, and I'm referring to him as that because I can't remember his name. He's some
okay.
famous. He's a famous Hillsong celebrity pastor.
It's okay.
And I just don't follow celebrity pastors.
Right.
I just have zero interest, so I don't even remember their names.
It's always a red flag, Jimmy, I think, when pastors are church hoppers, when they go from church to church. To me, the question just is always there. Why? Why did you leave? Because actually, the longer you stay, usually your congregants become more like family. At least that's how it should be. You have a great working relationship. If you have children, you don't want to pull them from school and put them in a new school. So the big question is always why, especially when it's an abrupt departure.
Right.
And I think that red flag alone is enough to ask some of these hard questions. They are hard for some people, but they are the necessary questions.
Yeah, and I think I want to encourage people not to hesitate to ask these because they're not unfair questions.
Right.
In fact, I think very strongly that it's unfair to not ask these questions. So we're just going to go through them. We have 8 of them. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. You could probably think of many more questions. If you have more questions, let us know what you would ask. But anybody who's being used as a character or performance reference, here's what I would ask. Number 1, are there any past scandals that you're aware of? That's a very specific question, very open-ended. Yes or no. If there are known scandals and they say no and they hesitate and they have to really think about it, that is a huge red flag.
Yeah.
And that should be the first indication that something did happen. They just don't want to talk about it. And you're going to run into that.
Well,
Trust me.
Sure.
Especially in the church. Even when they fire these pastors and frame it as if it was a resignation, for some reason they still feel so guilty about telling the truth.
I'll tell you why, because we have been so saturated with the idea that we're not allowed to gossip per se. And this would fall into that category. A lot of people would think of gossip. You know,
Yeah, they
have you
would
heard
think,
any,
though it's not.
have you heard any scandals? Well, right off the bat, somebody would say, well, that's just plain gossip. You know,
Yeah.
I'm not going to repeat that. But
Yeah,
you're
truth is
referencing,
not gossip.
right? You are
Yeah.
referencing, do you know anything that we need to be aware of
Yeah.
that went on? Okay.
Number 2, did anyone ever complain of or allege impropriety? So, impropriety is improper talk, improper behaviors, sexual behaviors. Was this somebody who preached sermons that constantly offended people, and they would test things, test people by pushing the envelope and seeing what they could get away with? Were there ever complaints of or allegations of any kind of impropriety?
That's a really good question, Jimmy. Really good, because that's a telltale sign of an abusive person if there have been complaints of impropriety.
Well, I mean, not to keep harping on Bieber's pastor, and I have to look that up. So give me a second.
You. That's really bothering you, right?
Yeah. So, what is his name? Carl Lentz.
There you go.
Okay. So, here are all kinds of articles. I mean, I just Googled Bieber's pastor.
Yeah.
Carl Lentz. So, here he had allegations clear back to 2017, and probably before that. I would imagine this goes way back. There were rumors in the church. People were coming forward saying that he was being unfaithful. So this goes way back. The church leadership knew about this. So this is not a surprise. So this question is really important. Did anybody ever complain of or allege impropriety? In the case of Carl Lentz, the answer is yes, yes, yes. Multiple people complained. Multiple people alleged impropriety. The church knew about it, and they kept it quiet until somebody didn't.
Right.
Number 3, did you ever witness times where boundaries were crossed? So in other words, did you personally witness? Never mind what you heard or didn't hear.
Right.
Did you ever witness times where boundaries were crossed? And that could be anything from inappropriate jokes to bullying. That happens a lot in ministry, where the pastor is, talking down to people, talking down to women,
right?
Putting people in their place, acting like they're the hen who rules the roost. Did they ever cross any physical, sexual boundaries? Did you witness anything where boundaries were violated? That is very straightforward, and that's an important question. I've never been asked these kinds of questions. All the times that I have been called by companies, by churches, when I was used as a reference, I've never been asked anything that even resembles these questions. Typically, I'm asked, I don't know the things that you're asked, but I'm usually asked things like, well, are they a team player?
Yeah. Are they a team player? Do they bring something extra to the team? Are they prompt? Are they on time?
Yeah.
Do they have excessive absences? All that type of thing. Never anything
very
beyond
surface.
that.
Yeah. Very
never
surface
anything.
questions.
Yes.
Number 4, we were just talking about this before we hit record on this, but what was the reason for his or her leaving?
Right.
Again, back to what you said, Mom, if this person has a history of hopping from church to church to church, what's the reason for that?
Right.
And it could just be that they just get bored That happens.
Every
There are
now
people
and
who
again,
are,
yeah. But,
there are people, I know people who are raised in military families where they're just so used to moving that's culturally part of their DNA. And there's not any scandal. There's not any bad blood. They leave on good terms. They get restless.
I've been in a situation now where I have the ability to hire and conduct, the appropriate questioning procedure and whatnot. And when I see on a reference that there have been, I've had as many as a young lady with 13 different jobs in 11 months. I'm thinking,
that's impressive.
What
a powerful work history you have.
And I asked her what happened here, and she just said, I can't really find the job that I like. That wasn't the truth. The truth was she just failed to show up for her work, and it's
I just love to work.
It's like,
that's what happened. I love to work.
But I find it amazing that people will list this even on their job resume, that they've had 4, 5, 6 jobs in the last 2 years. And I'm thinking that really isn't real good.
Yeah.
That's not real good. Never once have I had a person who has been hopping from job to job that has been a good employee. Every now and then I'll give someone a chance if they seem to have a legitimate reason, but it's never worked out. Not yet.
Yeah.
Not in this many years at all.
Well, I mean, what I like about these questions are it's going to create this inner turmoil especially in the church. It's such a bizarre culture, I think, where
it is.
We fire people on a whim, but then we reframe it as if they resigned on their own free will. And then when asked about that person, people clam up. I gave an example of a case where I was called about, this minister who does this. He jumps from church to church to church, gets fired from every single one of them. But it's always framed as he resigned.
Mm-hmm.
And so there, I spoke to a mother of a victim of this guy, adult victims, spiritual abuse. She called every church that she knew that this guy ever served at and said, what was the reason for his leaving? It's the same question that I just asked. What was the reason for his or her leaving? What was the reason for his leaving the church? She said every single one of them just clammed up and said, Mom, we can't talk about it.
Yep. Totally, Mom. Yeah.
So what I like about this question is it forces them to answer it, but if they have this inner turmoil where they don't want to talk about it or can't talk about it or refuse to talk about it, you can really press them on that and be like, well, did something happen? Follow that up with a more specific question. Did something happen that you can't talk about?
I think rarely,
what are you hiding?
Yeah, rarely you're going to get an answer, but you will be able to pick up through body language and different things that there are issues there.
Or just the refusal to answer the question. Right. I mean, it's a simple question.
Exactly.
What was the reason for his or her leaving? If you can't answer that,
right.
If you're beating around the bush and, I'm not at liberty to talk about that.
A legitimate answer, his mother got ill and he wanted to be closer to her.
Right.
Or my daughter went off to college and we wanted to be close to her. Something like that. But
or he just wasn't a good fit here and we had a mutual parting of ways.
Right.
Fine.
Okay, that's fine.
That's not scandalous.
Right. Mm-mm.
There's nothing scandalous about that at all. That there are times where... I've been at jobs where I've not been a good fit. I left and, it was a mutual agreement.
Yeah.
My boss certainly didn't want to hire or retain somebody who hated their job.
Right. Exactly.
There's nothing scandalous about not being a good fit. What is scandalous is if there's any form of abuse or bullying or, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, that's what's scandalous. Number 5, was he fired or did he resign? This is a fun one for me. Because, again, I harp on this a lot. I just wrote a blog post about this last month about churches that quote unquote resign their preachers. And, obviously that's a little sarcastic because what they do is they fire them and then say that they resigned. So the church is resigning the minister.
Exactly.
So that question, what's fun about it is probably 9 times out of 10, if they were fired and it was framed as a resignation, they'll look you in the eye and be like, oh, well, he resigned. So the follow-up to that was it a forced resignation?
Yeah. You're tricky, Jimmy. Yeah.
Well, you have to be because they
saw this happen
sanitize
a lot on the school level when a teacher wasn't ready for retirement, but they took early retirement. There were many times forced retirements for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
But, it was very easy to just say, well, she decided to retire early.
Yeah. So a forced resignation or a forced retirement is a firing.
Right.
It's not synonymous with a firing. It is a firing.
Yeah, it is.
And that's okay. I mean, if you're going to resign somebody, be honest about it and just say, yeah, it was a forced resignation because, whatever, fill in the blank.
Right.
Sometimes, not always, probably not usually, but sometimes churches or organizations will force a resignation instead of firing because of the terms of the contract. Because, a contract may specify that if this person's fired, there's no severance. So for the sake of the family, the wife and the kids and, for the sake of the family, they'll allow a resignation, but it's still a forced resignation. But which is okay. And I'm actually okay with that. I actually think that severance packages when people are fired is a graceful thing to do, not for the abuser, but for the family, because the family gets caught in the crosshairs, unfortunately. And they're innocent. They didn't bring that on themselves, and it's not fair to the family. I don't think so. I'm actually in favor, almost always, I'm in favor of some kind of a severance, even when somebody was forced out. But let's be honest about it. Don't frame it as a way where they resigned and they did it of their own free will and, paint it as this marvelous, they're riding off into the sunset on a horse, on a horseback and living happily ever after, because that's not what happened.
It's interesting when I think of your dad being fired from his first job when we were a young married couple. He just came home one evening and said, "You're not going to believe this. I got fired." And I didn't believe it. I was left with my mouth hanging open. And I said, "Why?" And I know I talked about this in other podcasts. He said, "Because I'm not a good communicator." He was a youth pastor at the time. Well, he made phone calls, and in 1 week, he was hired in the Somerset Church of Christ. Now, they, to my knowledge, well, I know, they never did any follow-up asking why he was leaving. They asked him, and he said, "Well, I'm from Pennsylvania, and we just want to get back in Pennsylvania," and thought this was a time. We had one child, had a second on the way, and it sounded legitimate. But there was no kind of any questioning like this. Nothing.
Well, and that's the problem.
Nothing.
I mean, yeah, somebody who's fired, they're going to lie through their teeth.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm from this area.
His decision.
Yeah.
He just decided he wasn't fit. It wasn't a good fit. He wanted to be a pulpit minister now, and he just took that job part-time while he finished up college, and he wanted to get back to Pennsylvania. Sounded good to them.
Yeah.
Sounded good. Hired.
And the problem is the previous church enabled that. They enabled those lies. They enabled him to get another job.
Shame on them for not,
where he produced victims in that church over a period of decades. I dealt with the aftermath
Mhm.
of his
You
abusing
sure
victims
did.
in that church.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
he was hired. What year was that? That was in the 70s.
1973.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going all the way back to
Mhm.
1973, the decision for them to not
Mhm.
ask
They didn't
a
ask
simple set of questions
anything like that. Nothing. Yeah. Nothing.
allowed a man who was ironically
Mhm.
very consistent at that church. He didn't hop from church to church.
Right.
He was a staple at that
Mhm.
church
Yep.
since 1973 all the way
Mhm.
to 2011 when he was
Right.
arrested. So, yeah, these questions they're vital. Was he
Well, like
fired
you
or
said,
did he resign?
interestingly, well, these telltale signs were definitely there. Boundaries were crossed. There was inappropriate things done and said. But nobody ever dealt with that either.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Number 6, did he use or abuse his power or position to get his way? Did he ever say, well, because I'm a pastor, fill in the blank. Even if it's painted in a non-harsh way, even if it's just, hey, come on, do me a favor just this one time.
mhm.
I've helped you out, as your pastor. I've helped you out all these years. Like that's a nice way of being manipulative and abusive.
Big time. Big
So,
time.
ask
Mhm.
really specific questions. Did he ever abuse his
Mhm.
power or position to get his way? Did he manipulate people into positions? Did you ever feel manipulated by him? Number 7, how did his family respond to him? What was his relationship like with his family? Was his wife kind of sitting off in the margins? Did you ever see times where she just quietly cried to herself and you never wondered why? Did you see signs of distress? What was and again, this isn't a telltale sign because I think our
Right.
family probably looked like the model family.
Well, looked like the model family. Absolutely.
But it's still an important question because if you have
is.
domestic violence going on,
Right.
you're more likely, if somebody's in tune with that, you're more
Mhm.
likely to see signs of distress. And then finally, number 8, what were his behaviors like around children? And that's an open-ended question. And the reason it's framed as an open-ended
Mhm.
question is if you frame it in another way, did he ever bother you the way that he interacted with kids? All of a sudden, you framed it in a way where people are going to emphatically say, no, 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 no.
Right.
And they'll leave it at that. This way, it's open-ended. What were his behaviors like around children? Oh, he was just a child magnet. Children seemed to flock to him.
He brought bags of candy to church and toys every
They
week.
sat in
for
his
the
lap
kids.
and,
Yes.
he played Santa Claus every Christmas, and kids just seemed to migrate to him.
Yep.
That's an answer that would make me a little hesitant.
Yeah.
And it would make me ask more specific questions. Did he offer to babysit kids? Did he have sleepovers at his house? Did he invite kids on play dates with just him and kids?
So a lot of people may say, "Well, Jimmy, you're crazy. These are weird questions." These things happen. They happen, and pastors do this. And what's interesting is we don't pay attention. We don't ask the questions. We don't question why. Your dad was notorious for having youth gatherings where he'd, do campouts and spend the night with young people. He loved to babysit. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever questioned it, including me.
Sure.
Of course, now I would. Now I know better. Now everybody's educated more. So these questions give a skeleton view of a person, I think.
But I think
they're excellent.
and I think the importance of these questions too is even if somebody is not trained, who you're asking these questions to, because you can't expect everybody to be trained. Not everybody. I mean, very few people have any kind of training whatsoever,
right,
as it relates to abuse dynamics and trauma. what's important about these questions is it's so simple to analyze and break this down and find out. I mean, you can easily find out if there was any kind of scandal or people who are uncomfortable or things that just didn't sit right, or attraction to children where they were spending all their time and wrestling with kids on the floor, and somebody might not be trained to think that that's weird and bizarre, but they're going to say it. They're going to be like, oh yeah, he was great with kids. He used to wrestle with them on the floor, and kids would always crawl in his lap. He was the grandfather they never had. Those are major red flags, and the person telling you may not know that those are red flags, but you should.
Right.
So, that I think that's the good thing about these questions is they're framed in a pretty neutral way where you can get really invaluable information.
Absolutely.
So anyway, those are our 8 questions. I'm certain we could think of many more, but if you guys have questions that you would ask, let us know. We had a couple respond to our last episode, and they gave some pretty good additional questions, and we do appreciate hearing
Jimmy and
about
I
those.
love to hear from you. We love to know when you're interacting with us. We love that. We get to do that on a personal level with our patrons, but we don't with our general population. So, please email, post on Facebook, whatever. Post your questions, send them to us, or your comments. Yes, this is a question I would ask, or, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, we'll leave you with this truth bomb for the day. The truth bomb is just simply don't be afraid to ask the right questions. There's nothing violating about any of these questions. These are all fair. They're very neutral, and it's just about finding information. Don't be afraid to ask these questions. Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.